Welcome to Leapcast. I'm your host, Dr. George James. Leap stands for leaders, entertainers, athletes, and performers. And I'm on a journey to connect with high achievers and highlight their unexamined human moments. Tune in to learn how these high-achieving Leap individuals were able to reach their greatest potential, face their most difficult challenges, and embrace the human moments that helped them along the way. If you want to get the episode highlights directly in your email, then head to theleapcast.com right now to subscribe. All right, welcome everybody to Leapcast, where we talk to leaders, entertainers, athletes, and performers. I'm your host, Dr. George James. Today, I'm always hype about my guests, but I'm super hype about our guest today, Shaka Senghor, who I've known for a minute, but really have had the opportunity to really get to know him a little bit more. And today, we're just going to jump into the conversation today. So, Shaka, thanks for just joining me. I really appreciate you taking the time, man.
Oh, man, truly honored, man. Excited to be here, and I'm sure we'll have a great conversation. So thank you again for having me.
I appreciate it. Look, I want to start off by this. Usually we get into the Leap story, which we will, but I want to say, like, I've never worn a hat on my podcast. I don't think I've ever seen you without a hat. So I'm like, look, my nod to Shaka is I'm going to wear a hat on the podcast today.
The Philly joint.
That's right.
I appreciate it for sure.
Because I know
that ain't all original colors though. What's going on with that?
No, because I decided I went with a different one. I was going to bring the other color, but I'm like, let me go with this one.
No, I like that one though. That's a vibe right there.
I hear you, man. And I know you always represent Detroit. Anywhere I'm around Detroit folks, I can't help myself now. I always say, what up, though?
What up, though?
So shout out to all the Detroit folks before we even get started.
Man, we like a tribe out here in these streets, man.
Oh, man, it was. Crazy. I was just like I said, just this conference, and I was next to a reporter, and he was out in Detroit. He's like, he couldn't help it. So we both saying what up, though, even though we're not even from there. So it's how we do
it. I love it, man. It's great.
But one of the things what I like to do to start is to really get what we call as the Leap story, which is try to learn more about your early beginnings, wherever you want to start. And I know, like, there's lots of different parts of that, but we'd love to kind of hear, a lot of times we know about where you are now, but we don't know kind of where you had to come from or what you had to experience. So if you don't mind, maybe take us back to those Detroit days and share a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, I grew up in the city of Detroit. I currently live in LA. Always represent the hometown. It's just so much about the culture that I love and experiences and the people. I think Detroit is one of those cities where, for the people who are newly discovering it, they're like, oh, wow, this is like a real jewel to the world. So much has come out of that city, Motown music, techno music, the auto industry, and, so many talented people. But I grew up in a neighborhood on the east side of Detroit, working class, somewhat middle class neighborhood. My dad was in the Air Force. He also worked for the state. My mom was a homemaker. But we had a very complex household. It was my parents did the kind of back and forth. They were married and they separated, got back together, separated. And my mother and I, we had a very difficult relationship. And, there was the physical abuse, the emotional and verbal. And when I was about 14, I ran away. At the time, I was a very smart kid. Academically, I was pretty much always on the honor roll or, scholarships and things of that nature. But definitely, when my parents began to do that back and forth dance, that had a great impact on me in a classroom. I just became disinterested. And then, when I was about 14 or so, I ran away from home, with this thought that somebody would just see this little smart, handsome little teenager and like take me in and raise me in a warmth and care that all, adult, children are worthy of. Yeah. And unfortunately, I found myself seduced into the crack cocaine trade. And I'm always really, intentional about calling it a seduction because I think that's something that we don't think about with young kids is how they're coerced into these environments. At that time I was vulnerable. I had been, on the streets for about 2 weeks, sleeping in my friends' garage and basements. And I met this guy in the neighborhood. He was like, look, man, just come hang out with me. I'm gonna take you to get something to eat. Make sure you got a warm place to stay, man, and help you get on your feet, And those are the things that lead to so many kids getting caught up in these cultures that they don't belong in. But I was that kid, and I found myself there within the first 6 months. All the horrific things of that culture happened. I was robbed at gunpoint. I was beaten nearly to death. My childhood friend was murdered. And I continued on in that culture. About 3 years in, I got shot multiple times standing on the corner of my block. In 16 months, I shot and tragically caused a man's death. And that led to me being sentenced to 17 to 40 years in prison. 19 of those years, ended up as how much time I served, with 7 of those years being in solitary confinement. So, despite those bad outcomes, I still love the hometown where I'm from. And, I gained so much from the culture of Detroit outside the negative things.
I appreciate you kind of going through the timeline. I want to kind of come back to the part where you said about, your parents back and forth, and, as a therapist, and, even just seeing them, friends and family, and how I try to protect my own family. Family life is crucial, right? And it's not
Yeah.
always going to be perfect. Like, there's always ups and downs and difficulties. But it just sounds like the back and forth, at least that was one of the things it sounds like a pivotal time for you with what your parents were going through. And maybe this is just me just adding, it didn't feel like you were maybe getting the support, connection, love that you needed. And it sounds like that's when you decided to roll out.
Yeah, I think it was one of those things where, you know, and I think about when my dad and my mom first separated. I was about 11 years old, and they sat us down. They kind of gave us the adult version of the decision making. Hey, we've decided to part ways, and there was no clear signs. Like, my parents didn't argue much in front of us. There wasn't that like relationship volatility, so they kept a lot of things, to themselves or between themselves. I don't know how they figured out. I'm sure they argued and went through all their things. So we was really kind of blindsided. And, there were some things that I think back on, like my dad, he worked, but I knew when he was always getting off work because I can hear his car. I can hear his car when he pulled up in front of the house. I can, hear all the kind of mechanics of him getting into the house and putting his keys out. And my bedroom was like over in the front of the house. And that was normal, what I'm saying? And then he would come in and you could hear him kind of, fitting around in the dining room. And then he'd go to the kitchen and, I'm assuming fix him something to eat. And then after a while, everything would be quiet, and the household was settled. And so it was unsettling to not have that.
Yeah.
And then it was like they got back together, and it was like this burst of hope. Like, I'm back in my original neighborhood, because when they separated the first time, we did the kind of split custody where I would go stay with my dad on the weekends and stay with him for the summer, and it was my siblings as well, and stay for them winter break and school break and whatever the things was. And it was great. I mean, it was a great experience because my dad is super chill.
Mm.
And I think part of the real thing was like, when my dad and my mom was together, my dad was complicit in the household dynamics, right? Like, my mother was very, about corporal punishment.
Mm.
When it was just me and my dad, my siblings, my dad wasn't about that. He was just like, look, go in there, sit down somewhere, cool out. And so it was like early on, it was creating this kind of divisiveness without even it, being a thing, because it's like, okay, well, why are you like this when it's just us compared to when, we're all together? So it was exciting for them to get back together in a sense of like, dad is back in the home, but then it's like the dynamics are changing again, right? And then they separate again. So it was like that back and forth just was hard to navigate. And, at the time, I just didn't have language for it. I was a kid, I didn't know what was going on, but what I did know is that it didn't feel consistent.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that. And, when I think about my own history, my parents were married, but it was non-traditional, right? Like, my dad would go back and forth between the States and Jamaica. And I learned as I got older, that was a way that he could make money. That was a way that he could feel like himself. That's a way that he feel like he could contribute. But it caused disruption. And when I hear you
Yeah.
just talk about the keys and the door and the routine, and sometimes I think a lot of people miss out on the routines that we get used to, and when those routines stop, how it causes a fracture or an issue or a struggle even.
Yeah.
And just to hear that, right, with what your parents were going through, how you had to deal with that as a kid, even without the words. And there's so many kids out there, so many young folks out there who don't have the words to describe the loss of routine that they have. And so I really
Yeah.
appreciate you kind of putting those words to it of what so many people experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's one of the things I even talk about now where, I just think parents can sometimes get so caught up in their own stuff that they stop thinking about, like, especially in those formative years, like, what does a kid really need?
Yeah.
And I feel like what I needed more than anything was just consistency, like just to know that the things that are normal about the household are going to remain that way. And I think that was that when they separated the first time, it was like, okay, this is what it is. We're creating kind of a new normal. But then it was like, oh, then y'all getting back together, and then y'all separate again. So now y'all just playing games. You know what I'm
Right,
saying?
right. Make up your mind,
And yeah, and as a kid, like you like, yo, what are y'all doing? Why don't y'all just chill out, figure it out, but stop dragging us,
Yeah.
into all of the craziness. But that's life, man. And it's like not having that language back then was really harmful because you couldn't, and like my parents and them was from that old school era where kids are to be seen, not heard. So we didn't have opinions that really mattered. You know what I'm saying? We didn't have input that they were going to really consider. So we was just left to kind of figure it out on our own.
Yeah, and and once again, right, having to figure it out and figure out the emotions, the all of that you could be feeling, and all right, so you make this decision to leave, right, and I hear that, and I appreciate how you language the seduction of the game, of the drug game, right, of the streets, right, and how it is seductive, right? It's alluring. It tempts you in so many ways, right? Like, even though that wasn't a part of my life, there was a way that I had friends where it was like, yo, I would look at them and I'm like, man, I'm still in school. They look like they driving to a new
Yeah.
car, right? I'll come home, I'm like the bus and train. I'm like, what am I doing wrong with my life,
Right,
right?
right,
And
right.
so there's, even from the outside, there's a seduction of like something about it feels good or right, or the
Absolutely.
life that's there. And so I could hear you saying that at 14, maybe, that it pulled you in on some level. But you went through a lot, man. Right, from
Yeah.
14 to 17, 14,
Yeah.
that's a lot that you had to go through. And I don't know how you navigated that from during those years.
Yeah, I mean, it was really tough, and like even just going back a beat, when you think about the allure of the game back then, like it was so different from now. Like we were making a lot of money in the streets. Like there was a lot of money. This was the beginning of the crack cocaine era. This was a time frame period where our parents, we were fortunate to have parents who were like gainfully employed. Like that was something special being like black in America to be like, yo, my dad got a good job. You know what
Yeah.
I'm saying? My dad locked in, he in the Air Force,
All right.
because we were just kind of emerging in that space, to where, the factory jobs and things like that, my dad's generation, they were able to, have gainful employment. But there wasn't a ton of disposable income back then. Families were really big. Like it was six of us,
Mm.
6 kids. So even if, my dad had a great job. In fact, he had two jobs, like Air Force and working for the state. But those dollars only stretched so far. So part of that seduction was like the money that can be accumulated in a short period of time, and then a sense of independence
Yeah.
and not being, feeling guilty because you're a burden, to your family because you ate one extra bowl of cereal when that needed to stretch because, just groceries wasn't coming for another 2 weeks. So there's so many different layers to like what was happening back then and the impact that had on, so many young guys. Like I think, my generation was the beginning of kids getting pulled into the world of drug dealing at a high level. It wasn't before that, of course, there were young people who kind of, got pulled into it. But my generation was that generation where you began to see just this swath of young black boys, who became, hustlers, and they call it trap house. Now we used to call it crack house. But guys who were like living in crack houses and hustling or on the corner. And it's just an era unlike anything that we'll probably ever see again, because of that, the newness of crack cocaine and newness of, so many things that was happening during that era. And, all those things was alluring and seductive, and, being caught up in it was just one of those things that, when you think about now, how I had to navigate through so many traumas. Like, I mean, the layers of what I witnessed, like even now when I go back and I think about it, I was shot, both of my brothers were shot. I can't even tell you how many of our friends was killed during that time. The shootouts we were, got into, and it was just trauma upon trauma upon trauma. And growing up in the hood, I didn't have any language for that. I didn't know it was like, oh, this is trauma, this is traumatic event. It was like, no, we just got into a whole situation today, and we just tried to keep it moving. But none of us, went to therapists. None of us even knew that that was even possible or necessary or really needed. So
I'm baffled by
yeah,
the stories I hear of, here in Philly, but all over the country, where someone could get shot or stabbed and go to the emergency room. They'll take care of them physically and discharge them that same day, right?
yeah,
Going right back to the same situations, circumstances, whatever it might be. And they were just traumatized. Or no matter how it happened, no matter how it went down, it was still a trauma that they experienced, and that never gets or hardly gets addressed and dealt with. And then when you talk about like all that you had to experience, and I appreciate how you also highlighted that for many young folks out there, for many young black folks, young black boys out there who might get allured or caught up, it starts off with, I don't want to be a burden to my family, or I want to be able to
mm-hmm.
provide or do something for my family, and then start to believe like, okay, this is a way. And then once the roller coaster starts moving, it gets really hard to navigate out of it, because you start to see some of those benefits, but also some of those traumas.
Yeah. Yeah, and I went through that phase. I remember at one point coming back home. My older brother had went to prison, and me and him was living together. I was living with my older brother. We were hustling together, living together. And then I found myself at like, 14, 15 years old with a house of my own, and I'm in the neighborhood. And, so that, I got all the little homies, all the little homegirls. And my other brother came through one day and was like, dude, like, what are you doing? Like, y'all over here just wilding out. It's like a frat house, basically. And he was like, man, I think you need to, pack it on up and go home. But at this point, I'm like so immersed in the streets. And when I went home, it was like foreign to me, like my dad trying to regulate how I move, when I'm like, I had made more money, in a day than he probably made, in a, a month or so. And that just didn't work out. My dad would try to take me to school. I would go to school. As soon as he leave, I leave out the back door. I kept it moving. And what I didn't even know then is like that was trauma playing out. That's like the brain is being reshaped at that point. Um, my I couldn't be regulated by like what's considered normal system. I couldn't even relate to like my friends who were my age in the neighborhood, because I was like had been so traumatically invested in that culture, in a way that just was beyond their years as teenagers. And
You had to
so
grow up like in
yeah,
such a, I mean, so many of the things that you had to think about and deal with were way beyond what we would want a 14-year-old to be able to do and to navigate. I mean, on some
yeah,
level it's good, right? Money management, like people skills and all of that, but at the same time, like, okay, figuring out, how you're going to move, which way you're going to go, and the intensity of that is, I could only imagine, is overwhelming. And like you said, it creates a level of trauma where your eyes and thoughts are not at the same level that it could be or should be. And with all that you said, right, you went through all that, and you've been very, from the day I've met you multiple years through Be Me, and you've been very clear and open about what you've done in your past, and also of the work you've done to be where you are now. And so you've always taken ownership and responsibility,
Yeah.
and you clearly did that, earlier. And I don't always see and hear that. And I'm wondering, like, how have you been able to clearly say, like, yes, I was in the game, I did a lot of the stuff, and I took a man's life and someone's life, and I own that. Like, how were you able to do that?
Yeah, it took me a while to get there. When I went to prison, I was wrapped in this cloud of just bitterness and anger, and I was accusatory. Like if this thing didn't happen, then that wouldn't happen. And there was a series of events that played out that led up to David's shooting that night. And I remember just kind of processing the things about that night that made me like the victim in a way, like if they would only did this, then I wouldn't have did this, or if this wouldn't happen. So I was DJing a party earlier that evening. I haven't really even told this part of the story. But earlier that night, I was like DJing a party, and they got into a shootout in front of the party. So a guy gets shot in front of the party. Now, at the time I'm DJing, I don't know who the person is. All I know is everybody's running, they jumping fences, they getting up out of there, right? It's the hood. It's what goes down, right?
Right, you gotta move.
So I'm like, we packing everything up. Our crew that's there, we like, okay, we gotta go, back to the house. Now we're literally like right around the corner. And so we're walking back after DJing the party, but everybody's on edge at this point because we don't know who got shot, who was the shooter. We don't know none of this yet. And when we was leaving, a truck pulls up, and I got a pistol on me at the time. We all on edge, like, yo, who is this? What's up? We don't know if it's our crew or whatever. We didn't have cell phones. You can just call and check. You got to page people back then and wait for people to call back. So we literally paging people and wait on them to come call back. And the guys in the truck turned out to not be any threat, And so now we're back at the house, but everybody's still wired up, still fired up when, David arrives at my place with another guy who I knew. Like I didn't know David that night, I didn't know the other person was in the car with him. I knew one guy who had brought them there, and they wanted to make a drug transaction. And it was for an amount that this guy never had made a transaction for, and then he's bringing two new guys. Mm-hmm. And so that escalated into an argument about whether they the police or not, like what's, et cetera, et cetera. And then that conversation escalated. And then, I ended up shooting, tragically causing David's death. And immediately I was like, man, like you shouldn't have brought him here. Why are you trying to force me to make a deal? If this thing wouldn't have happened at the party, I wouldn't even been here. So it was like this list of excuses that was kind of built in.
Yeah.
And, when I went to the joint, like, even though they were built in excuses, I knew, like, in the core of my being that, there was a moment when I could have kept walking, and I could have kept walking away, and I didn't choose that moment. And why I didn't choose it, I had all these other things that I couldn't identify back then. What I didn't understand was being triggered by having been shot 16 months prior in a similar situation, and really being scared and having anxiety and all these things. So because I didn't have a language, I began to utilize all these other things as my reason why this happened that way, as opposed to like literally what was happening inside of me. I was focused on these external things. And it wasn't until I began journaling and really writing down like the events of my life as I could remember them. And through that process, I began to, one, be able to identify things in my household that I wasn't responsible for, but that I felt guilty about. You know what I'm saying? I was able to label things correctly, like, oh, this wasn't discipline, this was actually abuse.
Yeah.
And then through that process, I was able to take ownership and responsibility, and was like, yo, it didn't matter why he was brought there. It didn't matter the circumstances. Ultimately, I'm the one who pulled the trigger, and I have to be responsible for that. And I have to acknowledge that, and think about the harms that I caused his family, how it caused him harm, and also how I caused myself harm, because me going to prison was harmful.
Yeah.
But it was a process. That journaling, man, was a game changer. And and I'll tell you this real quick. I mean, when I first went to prison, they have you see a therapist. This is my first time seeing a therapist. And the therapist asked me what happened, and I gave her the matter of fact, step by step. And then she labeled me as being antisocial, lacking empathy or remorse. And I remember how that felt. You know what I'm saying? I felt like she set me up because she didn't ask me how I felt about what it was. She asked me what happened. And so when I thought about it years later, it definitely gave me it was a poor representation of what therapists are tasked with doing. And so it took years for me to unpack that and be really like, yo, she just was one of those people who was hired by the system to reinforce the ideas of the system and to try to label a person whose experience she doesn't come from. Like I'm sure she wasn't on the block where, people get shot every day and people are, in these volatile environments. And this is life. This is not just a situation. This is like the culture. But then she has this label, and so it made me very untrustworthy of the institution of therapists because I just didn't see anybody who looked like me or came from where I came from, who I can even say like, yo, you understand me? Like I'm not excusing my behavior, but here's how I got to that behavior. You know what I mean?
No, and that's so unfortunate. I mean, that's one of the reasons why like I even got into this work, almost 20 something years ago, because I didn't really see a lot of black people and who understood, like I wasn't in the streets, but I was close enough, right? I knew enough people, right? Where like, but just understanding that enough helped me when I had to go to people's homes and neighborhoods and talk to folks. And unfortunately, yeah, people are paid to write reports that come out a certain way, right? Like, and not really ask the other questions that will give you the full story. And so I appreciate you highlighting that because I know a lot of people, their first interaction with someone in the mental health field was not cool, was not good, and now made them say like, I'm not doing that again. Just like you have you in a bad relationship, you might say like, I'm not gonna put my heart out there again. Like there's ways that people do that, and so I appreciate also you highlighting the journey you went on and how you specifically are saying David, right? I know you're intentional, right, and that you're using his name and being very clear about that and not taking it lightly. And how we sometimes take things lightly and move on. And just the other day I was working with a couple, and a lot of my work sometimes is trying to help people take responsibility for their own stuff. And how I've had to like work on my own self of like I need to take responsibility, but sometimes I don't want to. I want to be defensive. I want to say it's the other person's fault. Yes, there are other factors and things that built up to the moment and the choice, but I still got to at least own that I made the choice. I made the decision. And I really appreciate how you said that. And then how you also highlighted the anxiety and trauma from being shot, the anxiety of the moment just before, the hype, right? The just being, I was just recently talking about this kind of energized, keyed up, like almost on edge. And then here comes a situation. It almost leads to something happening that's not going to be good, but we don't know that, right? And so many people are in those situations, whether it be a bad choice at work or in a relationship or in the street somewhere. And just hearing you and your journey, I'm glad that you were willing to share that and how you use journaling to help you figure that out.
Yeah, journaling was really my therapy. Being able to just look at it on the page and being able to just write for myself is, I feel like, it's the shortest and truest pathway to your own truth. Because when I was journaling, and that's obviously if you're doing it right, it's like I'm writing all the things. Like I don't care because nobody got to read it but me. You know what I mean? Like, it's my journal, right? And it was so healing because it's like I can process this truth in a way where it's just about getting it out, and it's just about saying, and it's just about being honest and not hiding from the language that puts responsibility on me as a person, but also responsibility in spaces where it's hard. Like it's hard to say, my mother was abusive. Like that was so hard to say, especially like in Black culture where, so many people have abusive parents, but don't call it that. You just got your ass whooped, and it's like, no,
Right.
like, she was angry about something else. And this reaction to that anger was not proportionate to what the
Exactly.
situation was.
Yeah.
Um, and it was wrong. And it was hard to say that, until I began to journal. And my dad, like that was hard. My dad is like my hero. Like, but at a point, I had to get to a point where I was like, Dad, why didn't you do this right here? Like, why was that? Why didn't you not step up? And I began to understand his journey
Mm.
and understand his upbringing and understanding the dynamic between a husband and a wife and like so many things that, had I not had the ability to journal, I could have came away with a very different experience. Like I would not be healed. I would be coming out here after 20 years, probably like Debo or something. I would have had all this packed up rage and
Yeah.
anger and, this sense of entitlement, like the world owed me something. Um, and I was fortunate, but I wouldn't have got there, man, without great mentors who gave me books, man. Like I definitely want to like
Yeah.
honor the men who, challenged me to read, who, were my debate partners, who were warriors who basically, they sharpened me mentally, what I'm saying, through default, like I love to debate and they love to debate. And, they saw something in me I didn't see like in myself. At the time I was the most rebellious. These guys were the most present. They were like, man, you're a smart young brother. Like you're a natural leader. You know what I'm saying? Like, look, these young guys around here follow you. I'm like, I ain't leading them. They just hanging out with me. They like, nah, these cats are following you. You know what I'm saying? Like you have that thing that they're attracted to. So you have a greater degree of responsibility, right? And so those brothers led me to books, and those books led me to reading like things that weren't where I started. Like I started with Donald Goins and Iceberg Slim, and and that led me to Malcolm, and Malcolm led me to philosophy and Eastern philosophy, and that all that stuff really led me to like really beginning to understand meditation and understand journaling, and then just putting it into practice. Like theory was great, but it's like, okay,
Yeah.
let me see if journaling is really therapeutic. I'm about to write about this thing right here. Let's see how real this get, right?
Right.
And I remember I first started writing, man. I got into it with my neighbor, and I'm like, I'm still in it. Like I'm a goon on the yard at the time. I'm thugging it on the yard, and like this cat blew my power out. I'm like, man, I couldn't get to him because we in solitary. So I'm like, I'm gonna write about what I'm gonna do to him. And I wrote while I was in the heat of that anger. I'm like, I'm gonna stab this cat in the neck, throw him over the gallery. And man, when I calmed down, like a couple of days later, and went back and read that, I was like, this is madness. Like these are the thoughts of a madman. Like the guy blew the power out. It's not worth me like killing him. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
But in that culture, it's an acceptable response to disrespect. Um, but when I was in the soberness of calm and quiet, and I was able to go back and read those thoughts, I was like, yo, this is crazy. Like, this is not who I am as a person. This is not, at that point, I thought of myself as a nice guy, you know? But that's the BS that I was telling myself, right? Like, oh, you nice, because I can justify all these acts of violence that I had, you know, done. You know what I'm saying? Like, I wasn't like a good, model, what they would call a model prison. Like, I was furthest from that. People can't even imagine that now, bro. It was wild. I was wilding on the yard. You know what I'm saying? And so the thing that allowed it is because I really began to understand, like, oh, you have the charisma, you have the charm,
Mhm.
you have the ability to make sense out of things that don't make sense, right? You can justify why you're gonna shank this guy because of the indignity of him blowing your power out when he owed you money. You didn't do anything. You know what I mean? So it's like this whole manipulative thing that I learned from being within that culture, within the street culture. And so I had to unlearn that by like journaling through it, man, and meditating and like really clearing all of the clutter out of my mind that was like these narratives,
It's so
and
powerful,
yeah.
what you're saying about that, because so many times we don't review what we think and feel in that moment, or we don't go
Yeah.
back and look at the impulses that we have. And don't get this twisted, this is not about like people committing crimes or getting locked up or taking someone's life or being in the yard. Like, yes, that's your story, but I think that
Yep.
applies to everybody, that we
Absolutely.
don't pay attention and go back and like, yo, what was I thinking in that moment? Why did I do that? Why, like, I deal with a lot of folks who have cheated on their partner, right? Like, and when
Mhm.
we come back and we break it down, it's like you wanted a hug from your partner and you didn't get that hug, and now you just wanted somebody else, and now it's a ripple effect. And
Yep.
it seems like it's simple, but it's complicated and there's layers. But it's not until we start to unpack it, because I've seen people journal, but not always go back and read, even a few days later, to say like, "Yo, what was I thinking? What was I feeling?" And
Yeah.
I think like you're really sharing and modeling that. The other part I'm hearing, I mean, look, Shaka, I know you're mad talented. You got lots of skills, but even in your story, I hear it, right? Like you was DJing, you found a way how to navigate the culture and the game to be successful, even though with the
Yeah.
trauma. And then you're locked up. People, you're seeing your skills or seeing your leadership. You're reading. You're doing all this stuff, and I know that that really started to move into you being a writer. And
Yeah.
I guess what I'm curious about, were you always a writer, or did that start with the journaling? Like, how did you add that skill and talent to your repertoire of skills?
Yeah, it's so funny you ask. Like, when people would be like, "When did you begin writing?" I used to start off with like this, just kind of a story that turned out to not really be true, right? And not because I was being duplicitous. It was just more like, oh, I didn't think about this kind of thing, this series of other things that had happened. So when I had moved back with my dad, he got me in Cooley High School on the west side of Detroit, and I would, like I said, I would leave out the back, but I would hang out in this little area. And I remember this teacher, she would always see me and I would just really speak to her. Hey, how you doing, Miss Such and Such? And, very cordial, very respectful. And one day she was like, you're one of the most respectful kids. Why are you not in school? Like it's clear that you can speak, you're very, you have great communication skills. You're always mannerable. At least sit in my class every now and then. Right. So one time I pop in her class, she gives me the Killer Mockingbird. It's like, write a book report on this. Right. I read the book, write a report, give her the report. I'm sitting in her class. This woman literally comes and grabs me by my ear and twists my ear. She's like, "What is wrong with you, boy? Why is you wasting this talent standing outside my school?" You know what I'm saying? She's like, "You're like brilliant, you know?"
Mm.
And I'm like, "What are you talking about? It's just like a book." Because in my mind, it's a book report. It's not anything special.
Right.
But she's like, "No, like you know how to get up in there, right?" Fast forward, I'm in prison. A friend of mine on the cell block, he works for the paper. He's like, "Yo, can you write an article?" Bro, I'm running stores on the yard. I got, I'm just going down on the yard. What are you talking
Right.
about?
Right.
He was like, "Well, you smart. So at least, somebody left and can you write something?" I write up this piece real quick, and give it to him, A couple of months go past. I forgot I even wrote this thing and gave it to the brother. I'm coming back from work. These two cats approaching me. I'm thinking it's about to pop off because,
Mm-hmm.
I work in a rec center, so I can't always know what's going on with my squad until, yard open up, right? And the cat came up, was like, "Man, you wrote that article, bro. Like my auntie's going through this right now. My mom going through this, man. I just want to hug you, bro, and tell you I appreciate you." I get back to work. My supervisor's reading the article and he keep looking at me. And I'm like, "Tom, what's up?" He's like, "You wrote this?" I'm like, "Yeah." Because again, I'm not even thinking it's a big deal. I'm like, "Yeah, I wrote it." He's like, "Man, let me take this home to my wife." So he takes it home to his wife, comes back the next day. His wife is like, "This guy has the most brilliant raw talent I've
Wow.
ever seen. He just needs to work on his grammar a little bit, I mean,
I know
punctuation a
that
little
feeling.
bit."
I'm
And
still working
so
on my grammar.
yeah, and so back then, even at that point, I didn't even see writing as a pathway.
Mm.
I just was like, I took that into account, kept it moving. Years later, when I started writing, I was journaling, and I realized I hadn't completed anything in my life. I just hadn't completed. Up to that point, the only thing I had completed was GED. And so part of me making a decision to live my life differently, I needed to prove to myself that one, I can stick to my word, and and two, that I can complete something. And so through journaling, I was like, yo, I went back and read my journals. I'm like, I never finished anything. I started everything. I was on my way to the military, never went back to finish the test. Went to Job Corps, got kicked out, didn't graduate from high school, you know, started this job, quit 2 days later, started this. So I'm like, I'm always quitting. And so I was like, I need to challenge myself to finish something, because if I don't finish anything,
Yeah.
I'm never going to commit to changing my life. And so that's when I challenged myself to write a book in 30 days. And the goal behind setting a real strict, time limit was because if I didn't, I was never going to finish it. I can't tell you how many people I know who have started a book that they've been working on for 10 years, for 5 years, for 15 years, for 30 years, because there never has been an end game. And so I set that up, man. I wrote my first book in 30 days, and I was like, okay, that's cool. Can you write another book in 30 days? And so I started and wrote the second book, and then I started the third book, and then I fell into a bout of depression. And I fell into this bout of depression because I realized at that point, like, I had this talent that had been lying dormant all this time.
Yeah.
And that I could have been creating a life for myself, doing a whole bunch of things. And so that's when I began to write down kind of like goals for my writing, like what I wanted to happen. I knew I wanted Oprah to read one of my books. I knew I wanted to be a bestseller. I knew I wanted to write for newspapers and magazines and TV and the stage and like all these different things. So I wrote down like, hey, I'm gonna build a career through writing, and I got out and I did it, and I executed, and now I'm able to have writing credits, and
I love it. I love it,
man.
Write
on music and all type of stuff,
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to highlight that your talent and skill and ability, right? Like, and I think that you've also been very clear about, and your intellect, right? Like, that you are smart, talented, and able to then enhance these skills that you've had, right, over time, and writing being one of them, and how there's that's a real sobering thought, right? When you recognize, yo, I have skills, I have talent, and somehow I have not used that for my life, for humanity, and sometimes people still can shy away from it. I've talked and worked with people where they can hear lots of things in their own thoughts that it doesn't matter, or nothing will come out of it. But you got to this place where you recognize that I have really profound skill that can impact and change lives, and I haven't been using it. But it's not too late. And that's the part that I love, right? It's not too late, and I still got time. And then you start moving on to further goals. And of the goals that you set for yourself, how many of them have you checked off?
So I've checked off pretty much all of them, and I actually had to. It was so crazy. I was watching an interview with this rapper named T Grizzly. It's so funny. He's a Detroit-based rapper, and he used to pop into a class that I used to mentor at when he was in high school. And he went on to become have a big successful song, and he's doing his thing. But he was talking about, I think it was that interview. I watched him in interviews, but I just remember him talking about when people were asking him what's next after this gigantic song he had, and he was like, I accomplished my goal. He was like, if the next song isn't as big, as the next album isn't as big, it doesn't matter. I accomplished my goal, right? So I accomplished the goals that I set for myself from a creative and a writing standpoint. And some of them are still kind of rolling in, but the bigger beats are the goals, like, becoming a best-selling author, a successful writer, like those things have happened. Now I'm setting like new goals. And that's where I'm at now. I'm figuring out, okay, what is the new goal for me? What is the new kind of North Star or moonshot that I'm setting for myself? So I'm in the process of figuring that out now. What do I want the next 5 years to look like? And it's not just in my creative life, but in my household, and what kind of home life do we want? What do we want to build together?
Congrats on being engaged, by the way.
Yeah, appreciate that. Yes, that was a big step. on the journey, right? It's like, really building a partnership and, building our life together. So yeah, we started to put that together. Like, what is my individual goal?
Mm-hmm.
What is our partnership goals? And my goals are all over the place. As a dad, I got different goals, and like, but yeah, I've accomplished most of them up to this point.
I love that. And, I think that's just, it's inspiring to me, and I hope to other people who are watching and listening, the thought of like, you can achieve your goals, right? And and also to have goals that are really beyond you. At least I believe this, right? This thought of like
Yeah,
really stretching yourself even beyond what you think is possible, right?
yeah,
And even if you're not like a person of faith, but that it takes belief in in yourself, in the universe, in a higher power, in something that you can get to that place. And like I have a set of goals that I have to, right here in my office, and but I hear other people's goals, and that inspires me. And
yeah,
there is a moment, right, where you can get overwhelmed and discouraged, and you got to really be careful of those negative thoughts. But then there's a part where it's like, nah, man, like, yo, Shaka, like, I'm inspired by what he did. Then I can do that too. And so I love that you've done
yeah,
that from your books. And I really, really support and encourage folks where they have the, like you said, individual goals, couple or partnership goals, and then the family goals, because they're different and it doesn't look the same. To be consistent and show up as a dad is different than like, I want to be a bestseller. They might have some key points together, but it's also different.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's the thing too. Is like, even within parenting life, a lot of times we're not looking at, okay, do I have a goal? And sometimes they can be small things like, do I not cuss as much today, or do I not fuss as much
Right.
today, or do I make sure that I get one-on-one time? You know what I'm saying? That I'm intentional about us getting away and doing something. Like, what are the things that I need to be intentional about? And so they look all kind of ways. I just really realized, like, recently, like, I'm like, man, I don't read at night with my son as much as I used, because now he's reading on his own, right?
Yeah,
But
that's a
I'm like,
bummer.
oh, I actually kind of miss the routine of that, and I want to bring that back. Um, so that's a goal now. You know what I'm saying? Is to find books that I can read that he'll be interested in.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little bit different from when, he was 10, or maybe he's just reading to me, but we'll figure it out. So I think in those ways, it's always the opportunity to set new goals.
I love that. For my family and I, it's been, we've had some losses, right? I lost my mom last year. My wife lost her grandmother, and that's really kind of put us into this place of like creating memories, right? And so that's been like a family mantra and a family goal. The thought of like, you know, there are ways that we could create memories and create moments and experiences with each other. Sometimes
Yeah.
that means taking time. Sometimes that might mean paying a little bit more than I want to,
Mm-hmm.
but it's worth it to create the memory. And it's a goal that I love that we've been able to work towards and to achieve. So as we wrap up, there's a few questions I'd like to ask everybody, and I think like
Mm-hmm.
you've been sharing some of this. I'm super happy and proud of you, all that you've done. From the best-selling books, Oprah, all that. But I was really wanted to hear your story. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about what is it that you're working on now, right? You've done lots of great things.
Yeah.
What would you say that you're working on now?
Yeah, I think my most important work now is really my work in at our company. I get a chance to work with the most incredible sales team. I'm the head of sales and success culture. And it's great, man. I get a chance to work with like legitimate entrepreneurs and hustlers at a different level. So I'm really excited about that. I'm still writing. I'm always going to be writing. I'm working on the ideas for a new book. I am
I
getting some
got
of
the
my
other one
old
right here.
stuff. Yeah, man, that book is powerful. I'm getting my old stuff edited, my original fiction. So at one point there in my life, I want to get back to fiction based writing, but I'm
Right.
starting with the four that I've already written and getting those, edited and getting those prepared for publication. So those are the things that I'm working on in a career space. And then, we got a wedding to plan at some point, got to
Yeah,
make time to do that. But that's the exciting part of life right now.
that's great. And you've had the opportunity. I know that you just recently shouted out like your collab with Nas, and once again the multiple talents that you have and
Yeah.
abilities that you've invested in to grow them and create out of it. And so I'm wondering, like, who's on your list that you would love to work with or collab with that maybe you haven't already?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to collabing with Kenya Barris. You know, like I I love his writing. I love his writing style. We're actually in talks right now to do a project together.
Nice.
But when I think about the people that I want to work with in the world, he's one. I've always wanted to work with oh man, what's this brother name? He's a dope director. It's gonna come to me probably as soon as we hang up. But there's this brother, man. He's a director that I love. He directed Training Day.
Okay.
Um, and this brother, I love his direction. I think about working with him. Um, yeah, that's it, man. One day I want to work with my one of my guys. He's really a great friend of mine. He's one of the best,
Oh,
venture
Antoine
capital. Yeah,
Fuqua.
Antoine Fuqua. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love his direction. So hopefully one day I can work with him on something. Um, and then my guy Ben Horowitz, man. I hope to work with. Him on something big one day.
That's
So
awesome.
yeah.
I love it. And while we talk about collab, I want to put it out there. When you were talking about, like, journaling and what that did for you, and I know the books that you put out, I would love this idea of really integrating that with more with like mental health and maybe even a guide. And I don't know if you've already done that or thought about that, but that's definitely something up my alley, and I would love to maybe talk more about that in terms of how to really help people use these tools and prompt them through to get to a place of self-discovery and healing and just release.
Yeah, we can definitely do that, man. I'm excited. Like one of my goals was to put a guide together for Letters to the Sons, a society. We end up putting a curriculum guide together for Righting My
Awesome.
Wrongs.
That's good.
But I'm definitely looking forward to that. So I would love to collab with you on that if you're interested in that.
Always.
We can make it happen, but we can do it with that or independent of that. But I think it's a valuable tool to add to the collective toolbox.
Last two, thanks. And last two questions. And you've answered some of this, but I would love to hear your thoughts. What does mental wellness mean to you?
Yeah, to me, when I think about mental wellness, I think of it as like mental wealth, like make sure, feeding the mind things that, really optimizes, us for life. Like, how do we think about a thing? How do we think about what we feel? What are the ways that we implement the things that we've learned in our real life in real time? And, how do you take it from theory to practice? But it's that input, recognizing and being aware of the inputs that we take in, whether it's, music, TV, conversations that we're consuming, and then how we're processing what we're consuming. How do we separate, oh, this is just entertainment from like, oh, this is real life. And then just being conscious of what the background narratives, what are the stories that's running in the back of your mind, to me. So mental wellness is just that full on, awareness of like all the things that are happening, good, bad, or indifferent inside of our minds.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I just think about like how sometimes, especially the things we take in, we don't realize how much it triggers us, adds to our anxiety or depression, or even, just our thoughts, and how we got to be aware of it. Sometimes it's just entertainment, and other times it's not. Last
Absolutely.
last question. What mental wellness advice would you give to your earlier self? Meaning anywhere from yesterday to much earlier in your life.
I would say the mental health advice would be to write it down just to get it out. So journaling and then meditation, man. Meditation is such a great tool to have in your toolbox, but if I had to choose between those two, it would be journal, journal, journal.
I love it. Shaka, there's so much more that I know that we could get into and talk about. I've had like 50 other questions I would love to ask.
Yeah.
I just appreciate how you take responsibility, how you take ownership, how much you want to impact people's lives, how much you want to impact Black folks, young Black men, and how you want to stand up as a father, as a just someone in the community, and also someone who's not shy to embrace their talents and to make goals out of those talents and gifts and abilities and your intellect all together. So I appreciate you coming through on Leapcast. Congratulations again on the engagement and wedding planning, all the fun stuff that comes with that. Wish you well to you and your sons. And, before we go, any last words before we wrap up?
No, I just appreciate you creating the space, man. I'm really looking forward to us working more together.
Yeah.
Because I think, the work that you're doing is one of the greatest gifts to the world, for us to have a safe space to really talk about our mental health and well-being. And especially like as a Black man, it's not to exclude other people, but I know how difficult it is, to find, therapeutic outlets that, really understand the environments that we come from. So, thank you again for creating a space for us to have real conversations. And I look forward to us building in person for sure.
No, man, definitely. I know there's going to be a lot more opportunities for us to build and that we'll create it. So thanks again.
All right, bro.
Wow. What an incredible ride we just went on with another great member of the Leapcast community. I appreciate you listening and hope you got some tangible value from the episode. Please let us know what you think by leaving a comment, rating, and review. As always, please don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. This is Dr. George James, and I'll see you next time.